I'm starting.
Oh, you're starting. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So in my experience, I've only really ever experienced like a pre-crisis mode. I've lived it personally. I've lived in Arizona my whole life, so we've never like had to have a pre-crisis mode because we don't have natural disasters or things like that. So I think that I don't like even understand that. But on work, in work, I used to work for an event company, and pretty much the entire way you make an event go smoothly is thinking of all those things that could go wrong, like the way that someone could trip, the way the flow of traffic could go wrong. What are we going to do if someone shows up without a ticket? What if someone's upset? Like, what do we do to make sure everyone is safe and then also has a good time, because that's the way that they'll want to come back next year. And same with when I worked for doing marketing and in the corporate office for a restaurant group. We had 13 restaurants and we had to pull all of the romaine, and we didn't have like a plan of action. Like, we hadn't done any pre-crisis management. So it was like scrambling and everything was like way delayed to like getting the information out to our employees, putting up signage. Like, we literally had to create signage like as this was going on. And really it made us realize that we needed a pre-crisis. So we ended up creating like all of these things that were sort of set in place, had that ever happened again, that it could happen in a split second, versus us taking almost 2 hours to decide what we were going to do, how we were going to do it, and potentially risking people in that moment. It put us up for a lot of liability, and obviously we could have had a way larger crisis of someone actually getting sick from our food.
Yeah, I completely agree. And going into that topic of pre-crisis, I feel like that's the most crucial part. Is not being. I'm sorry if you guys hear a vacuum. I don't think people know I'm in here. I like this quote. It says from the book, during these periods of normalcy, leaders typically assume that the risks of a crisis occurring are low. So essentially, that had me thinking about not just businesses but in life. When you have your guard down, I think that's when we're most vulnerable. And so taking that back into organizations and leaders and bosses, CEOs, when they're not expecting a crisis, they become complacent and they often think, everything's going smooth. So they're not even going to entertain the idea that something tragic or detrimental could happen. So I think it's I think it's imperative that companies, businesses have multiple hypothetical situations in place, or like simulations in place, where you are at, doing event coordinating at the restaurant. Like you have to plan and expect for disasters to occur. And also going into, like, if you're not prepared, as the example from the book was talking about BP. So I'm going to use the example of BP and Tylenol, and um, those two corporations handle things completely different. So on one end of the spectrum, you had BP that was the prime example of what not to do. The CEO, when the Gulf Coast spill occurred, did not take he did not want any part of it. He didn't want to take responsibility. He blamed other people. So essentially, other organizations had to step up and really try to, uh, manage this crisis when he's the one that should have been doing it. And he just evidently wasn't equipped and was complaining about how stressed he was and how he didn't want to do this anymore, when there were, I think it was 5 to 7 people that were killed. I can't remember how many were killed. And then obviously the devastation that the oil spill caused for the people in that area that lived there. He had no consideration. He didn't even like acknowledge the magnitude of what this spill caused. And then on the other end, you have Tylenol, whose CEO immediately swung into action and called had a major recall on all the Tylenol that was laced with cyanide. So he was swift in his action. He made obviously a press, whether it was a press announcement, um, he made a public announcement about what happened. Like he took care of it as opposed to the CEO who wanted nothing to do with it. So I think he had a better he's obviously the prime example of, okay, here's a crisis and now how the post crisis, like what do we do to resolve it? That was my example for those two.
Awesome. Am I going next, guys? Sorry.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So what I wanted to talk about for crisis scenarios, where leadership shows is when having experience in the restaurants. For the pre-crisis, is when the managers cut. Sorry. Let me cut this off. So anyways, when the managers cut the servers early, they don't expect to get a pop, and then they do, and people start to come in. And the leaders typically prepare in their head. They kind of see it coming. They're like, okay, a lot of people are coming in. How am I going to prepare for this? And then a lot of the times, the immature, the newer workers or newer servers kind of tend to not be prepared, or they wait to the last second until the crisis really hits. And then people aren't getting greeted. They're not getting their food. Their food comes out late. One mistake turns into two mistakes. Once one table turns into an entire section, and then that server is going to get cranky and start yelling at everyone in the back. And then you don't want to help that person because you don't want to help the person who's yelling at you, or doing something because their tables. Well, you got your own stuff to worry about. So I think in those times you can kind of see when leadership shows, because even when I was a server, because every time everyone gets in that position where they're like, oh crap, I gotta stay on top of this. You definitely remind yourself, well, one, be respectful to everyone. Two, do the best you can and don't panic, because the minute you panic, like I said, that'll turn one mistake into three mistakes. And so, and then also going into that, that's when you see the leadership from the managers, how the managers handle those crisis situations. Says a lot. A lot of the managers who have been there, done that, they kind of know how to be relaxed, or they talk stern. They can let everyone know that it's serious, but there's also showing control, because when the managers start to freak out, that's when you even see some of the best servers start to freak out, and that's never and that's never good. And so especially how they handle the post crisis as well. I always think it's good to take care of the customers. I've worked at places where they're just like, yeah, sorry, we had bad service kind of thing. Like, we'll give you like 20% or something, and not giving the full amount or whatever that person probably deserved. And you kind of get to see how different some nicer restaurants are, because they definitely take care of the customers more. Where I worked at a few places where I started off, and they didn't. They're like, oh, sorry, we had bad service. Like, have a good day. And so I think that shows a lot about leadership during crisis situations.
Yeah, I think tying on to what you said, for the crisis management, I think the part that people misstep is the establishment of credibility. Because when you get into situations like that where it starts spiraling, and then it gets one mistake turns into two, and so on, it just keeps going, rather than the manager stepping in and taking credibility for why the service didn't run smoothly, rather than them getting credibility and figuring out how to do initiating actions and coordinating activities to fix the problem. They just stand there and they point blame at everyone else. Like, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? Why did you do it this way? Why didn't you help out? Blah, blah, blah. And it just spirals into this giant thing of credibility issues where no one wants to take the blame for a collaborative effort that didn't work, regardless of if it was one person. If it was one person's fault, why didn't someone else see that and come and help and address the crisis before it became a crisis? So I feel like it's spirals back and like leads back to the credibility to begin with, because if a manager is not worthy enough to take the role as the manager and accept the responsibility for things that don't work out the way they think it should, then they don't deserve to be in that role, because their role is to take credibility and assess the situation so that it doesn't happen, or you don't get places where they don't have sorry for the bad service. Like that shouldn't happen.
For sure. Yeah, when I did the marketing and things for the restaurant, I also handled like our customer service and Yelp pages and things like that. And we would coach our managers that like, if someone's unhappy in the restaurant, like you should be addressing that crisis or that issue right there. They shouldn't leave the restaurant upset still and want to write a review. Like instead, you should manage it so that it's then not, because it becomes a larger PR thing, right? Like the crisis it extends where other people now know about it, where it could have just been managed and been micro in the restaurant and not a public thing. Same thing with like letting people go. Like you have to think about the bigger picture. Like maybe it's better to pay my employees to just kind of sit here in case, versus like letting people go, and in the grand scheme of things, and that make people not want to come back to our restaurant, which would end up losing us more money.
Yeah. Just really quick, I had an experience like that where the food took a long time, and I tried to assuage the situation by telling the guest, like, hey, I'm really sorry. I always try to say, I'm really sorry. I apologize. Well, the guy wanted another bottle of wine, and I was like, well, okay, I understand that. I'm like, but I need to get the manager because I can't make that decision. But, he's like, well, I want to talk to the manager. Okay, so my owner came out and was like, hey, I'm sorry, da 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 da. Well, that still wasn't sufficient enough. So anyway, so long of the short, the story on, but my manager came out, and at the end, or like towards the end, he was like, hey, I'm so sorry, our sincerest apologies, like here's the other bottle of wine, and basically gave them the wine and said, to make peace and ask for forgiveness. So after that, he told me it's better to give them a bottle of wine, because they had been there before. Give them that bottle of wine then because if we didn't, it would have been a bigger situation. They would have like done the Yelp, or like told that the next person and the next person, and
Or not
they're
come
going to tell
back.
people, or not come back. And he's like, it's not even worth like the $20 some. Just give them the bottle of wine. So sometimes you have to eat the $30 and just, yeah, exactly.
For sure.
So yeah.
All right. I think that was a good chat.
Lovely.
Awesome.